I never thought a room full of people could make you feel so completely alone. Not until tonight. The air in the terrace was thick with the scent of money and old-world perfume, a delicate dance of hushed conversations, the gentle clink of crystal, and the distant hum of Manhattan traffic 7 stories below. It was the kind of place my sons loved, a place that screamed success in quiet, confident tones. A place I was meant to feel proud to be in, dining with the family I had built from nothing. But as I stood at the edge of their table, the warmth of the room turned to ice. 4 chairs. 4 water goblets. 4 pristine, folded napkins. David, my eldest, the bank vice president, wouldn't meet my eyes. He fussed with his tie, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over my shoulder. Mark, the engineer, shifted in his seat, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face before being quickly suppressed. He picked up his fork, then set it down again. And Chelsea, David's wife, simply watched me. Her smile was a thin, perfect line of polite cruelty. There was no seat for me. The host, a young man with a carefully neutral expression, had already confirmed it. "I'm sorry, ma'am. The reservation was for 4. I had felt the familiar heat rise in my cheeks, the dull throb of a humiliation I had known my whole life, the feeling of being an inconvenience. An afterthought. I had spent 40 years as a housekeeper and a nanny, cleaning the homes of women like Chelsea, raising their children while my own went without. I knew the sting of being looked through, of being treated as part of the furniture, but to feel it from my own children? In a place like this? It was a new, deeper kind of cold. My story isn't unique, it's the quiet reality for so many who give everything and are left with echoes. But before we continue, make sure you've subscribed to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching this video from. We're really happy to know that our stories have reached people everywhere. My gaze drifted back to the table. I saw it all with a sudden, painful clarity. The way their clothes hung just so, the casual gleam of their watches, the easy confidence that came from never having to worry. Not really. I had done the worrying for them. The 5 a.m. mornings, the aching hands raw from bleach and scrubbing floors, the years of scrimping and saving so they could have the degrees, the condo down payments, the big weddings. I had paid for the very suits on their backs. And they had left me standing. Chelsea finally broke the silence. She leaned forward, her voice a low, condescending whisper that carried across the table like a poison dart. "Teresa," she said, the use of my first name a deliberate little jab. "Perhaps a more affordable place would be more your speed? We can call you an Uber. 2. More affordable." The words hung in the air, shimmering with contempt. She was telling me I didn't belong. That the woman who had funded their entire lives was now too poor, too common, to share a meal with them. She wasn't just dismissing me, she was erasing the decades of sacrifice that had put her in that very seat. My mind flashed to Ellen, my youngest, lost to pneumonia because I couldn't afford the private care that might have saved her. The memory was a hot knife in my gut. And here was Chelsea, dripping in designer clothes, telling me I was the one who was out of my depth. Something inside me, a tightly wound spring. Turning my back on them was not an act of retreat. It was an act of reorientation. For nearly 70 years, my world had been oriented around them, their needs, their futures, their comfort. I had been their North Star, their silent benefactor, the gravitational force that held their comfortable lives in orbit. Now, I was turning on my own axis. The universe was about to be rearranged. Every head in the restaurant followed me, a silent, synchronized swivel. I could feel their collective gaze on the sable coat, on my straight spine, on the deliberate, unhurried pace of my steps. The walk from their booth to the host stand at the front of the restaurant was perhaps 50 feet of plush, wine-colored carpeting. It was the longest and shortest walk of my life. With each step, I felt the layers of the person they thought I was, the frail, simple-minded, financially dependent old woman sloughing off like a dead skin. The woman emerging beneath was someone they had never met. She was someone I had kept hidden for a very long time. I was not walking. I was making a procession. The young hostess, whose name tag read Chloe, looked up as I approached. Her eyes were wide, her face a mixture of professional anxiety and raw curiosity. She had witnessed Chelsea's dismissive wave and my unsettling laughter. She was likely expecting me to leave in a storm of geriatric tears or, worse, make a scene. I offered her a small, calm smile. It seemed to unnerve her more than the laugh had. "Good evening," I said, my voice even and low, a stark contrast to the performative boom of my laughter moments before. "Ma'am," she stammered, gripping the large, leather-bound reservation book like a shield. I'm so sorry, there seems to have been a misunderstanding with your party." "There has been no misunderstanding," I corrected her gently. "There has been a clarification. I will be dining alone tonight." She blinked, confused. "Oh. Of course. We are quite full this evening, but I can see if we can find a small table for you near the bar." I let the silence hang for a beat, letting her well-intentioned but insulting offer dissipate in the air between us. My eyes drifted past her, toward the grand archway that led to the main dining room. I knew every inch of this place. I knew the specific type of Italian marble under my feet, the thread count of the Belgian linen napkins, the name of the artist who had painted the brooding landscape of the Hudson Valley that dominated the far wall. I knew the foundation of this building was laid on the bedrock of my own life. "That won't be necessary," I said, my gaze returning to her. "I'd like table 1, please." Chloe's professional smile faltered. A flicker of panic crossed her face. Table 1 was not just a table. It was an institution within an institution. Tucked into a discreet alcove, it offered an unparalleled, panoramic view of the park, shielded from the rest of the dining room by a sheer silk curtain and a magnificent spray of white orchids that were changed daily. It was never offered. It was never on the reservation list. It was held. Always. "Ma'am, I'm afraid that table is permanently reserved," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if letting me in on a secret. "Yes," I said. "It is. For me." Before she could formulate another polite refusal, a voice cut through the air, smooth and authoritative. "Is there a problem here, Chloe?" Eli Grant moved toward us from the archway. He was a man who moved with the quiet efficiency of someone utterly in command of his environment. Tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that cost more than my first car, with silvering hair and the keen, intelligent eyes of a hawk. To the world, he was the esteemed general manager and public face of the terrace. To me, he was the scrappy kid from the Bronx who'd been the best busboy I'd ever met, the one I'd taken a chance on 15 years ago. My business partner. My friend. Chloe looked relieved. "Mr. Grant." This lady was asking for table 1. Eli's eyes met mine. There was no surprise in them. Only a deep, unwavering current of understanding and respect. He had seen my family arrive. He knew who they were and, more importantly, he knew how they treated me. We had spoken about it, in quiet moments in his office, over accounting ledgers and glasses of whiskey. He had been waiting for this day as long as I had. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned to the hostess, his tone softening but losing none of its authority. "Chloe, you are new, so you have not yet had the pleasure of an introduction. This is Miss Teresa Carter. Table 1 is her table. It is always to be made available to her, at any time, without question. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mr. Grant," she whispered, her face flushing crimson. He turned back to me, and the professional formality melted into a genuine, quiet warmth that was reserved for me alone. He took my hand, not shaking it, but holding it for a moment, a gesture of profound loyalty. "Tessa," he said, his voice low. "It's good to see you. Your table is ready, as always. Shall I inform Chef Antoine you'll be dining with us tonight? He's been experimenting with a white truffle risotto I think you'll appreciate." From across the room, I could feel the tectonic plates of my son's world grinding to a halt. I didn't need to look at them to know what was happening. I could feel it in the sudden, absolute stillness that had fallen over their booth. I could picture it perfectly. David, the banker, would be the first to process the information. His mind, trained to think in numbers and hierarchies, would be frantically connecting the dots. The deference from the general manager, the name Miss Carter, the impossible command over the restaurant's most coveted table. He would be calculating the value of this establishment, the revenue streams, the sheer financial weight of the words her table. The blood would be draining from his face as he realized the woman he thought was a financial liability was, in fact, an asset of terrifying proportions. Mark, the engineer, would be slower on the uptake, processing it not as a financial equation but as a structural one. The foundations of his reality were cracking. The mother he knew, the one who brought over homemade soup when he was sick, who hemmed his trousers, who was always just. There was suddenly an unknown quantity. He would be looking from me to Eli, his expression one of pure, uncomprehending shock, as if the laws of physics had suddenly been suspended. And Chelsea. Oh, I could imagine Chelsea's face most vividly of all. The carefully constructed mask of bored, Upper East Side superiority would be shattering into a million pieces. This wasn't just about money. This was about status. The restaurant where she had just tried to humiliate her mother-in-law, the very place she used to signal her social standing, was owned by that same mother-in-law. The shame would be a physical blow, a hot, searing wave of social annihilation. Her sneer about a more affordable place would be echoing in her own ears, a death knell for her reputation. Eli gestured for me to precede him. This way, Tessa. I allowed myself a slow, deliberate glance back at the booth. Their faces were exactly as I'd imagined. 3 statues carved from ice, their skin pale and waxy in the restaurant's golden light. The half-eaten appetizers sat forgotten on their plates. David's mouth was slightly agape, his eyes wide with a horror that was almost primal. Mark looked like a lost child. And Chelsea. Chelsea looked like she had seen a ghost. A very wealthy, very angry ghost wearing a vintage sable coat. My gaze met David's. I saw the frantic question in his eyes, the silent, desperate plea for an explanation, for a denial, for this to be some kind of elaborate, cruel joke. I gave him nothing. No anger. No smug triumph. Just a calm, level stare that confirmed everything. Eli, ever the professional, paused as he prepared to lead me away. He glanced toward their table, then back at me, his expression neutral. Miss Carter, he asked, his voice carrying just enough for them to hear, will your guests be joining you? The word hung in the air, guests. Not family. Guests. People with temporary, conditional access. People who could be asked to leave. I held my son's terrified gazes for one final, monumental moment. I thought of my daughter, Ellen, who died because I couldn't afford the care that might have saved her. I thought of the 5 a.m. subway rides. The aching hands, the swallowed pride. I thought of the college degrees, the down payments, the weddings, all investments I had made in men who now saw me as a burden. I gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of my head. No, Eli. I said, my voice clear and steady, a bell tolling the end of an era. They're fine right where they are. The silk curtain whispered shut, muffling the dining room's golden hum into a distant, irrelevant murmur. Eli had seated me himself, pushing the heavy velvet chair in with a practiced, respectful grace before giving me a final, knowing nod and retreating. I was alone now, cocooned in the quiet sanctity of Table 1. Outside the vast, floor-to-ceiling window, the lights of Manhattan glittered like a carpet of fallen stars, a breathtaking panorama of power and ambition. The view I had purchased with my life. I picked up the heavy crystal water glass, its surface cool and smooth against my fingertips. My hands, now manicured and adorned with a simple, elegant diamond ring, looked like the hands of a stranger. They bore no resemblance to the hands I remembered, the ones that were my truest biography. The real story of my life wasn't written in a book, It was written in the scar tissue of my knuckles, the permanent ache in my joints, the phantom burn of industrial strength bleach under my fingernails. The city lights blurred. I wasn't seeing the skyline of today. I was seeing Queens, 40 years ago. A cramped, second-floor walk-up that always smelled of damp plaster and boiled cabbage. I was 30 years old, a new widow after a drunk driver had turned my husband, a good and honest construction worker, into a statistic. I was left with 3 children, a mountain of grief, and a future that felt like a sheer, unscalable wall of ice. David was 8, already serious and watchful. Mark was 5, a sweet and gentle boy who still looked for his father by the door every evening. And then there was Ellen. My Ellen. She was 3. All bright eyes, tangled curls, and a laugh that could make the wilting flowers on our windowsill perk up. She was the light in the suffocating darkness of that apartment. And then, the light went out. It started as a cough, a common winter cold. But in the drafty, poorly heated rooms of our apartment, it settled deep in her tiny chest. It became pneumonia. The doctor at the crowded public clinic gave me a prescription I couldn't afford and told me to keep her warm. I boiled pots of water on the stove to create steam. I held her for hours, her small body burning with fever against mine, listening to the horrifying rattle in her lungs that grew louder each day. I could feel her slipping away from me, and my powerlessness was a physical poison, a living thing that crawled up my throat and choked me. There was another option. A private hospital with specialists, with breathing treatments, with a real chance. But it required a deposit that might as well have been $1 billion. I begged. I pleaded with my husband's estranged family. I tried to borrow from neighbors who had even less than I did. The answer was always the same. A sad shake of the head, an averted gaze. Money was a locked door, and my daughter was dying on the other side. She died in her little bed on a Tuesday morning, just as the weak winter sun was struggling to pierce the grime on the window. She was so quiet. The terrible rattling had stopped. For one beautiful, delusional moment, I thought she was better. But her stillness was absolute. The absence of her breath was the loudest sound I have ever heard. Something broke in me that day. And something else was forged in its place. A vow. A cold, hard, diamond-sharp promise I made to her tiny, still form. Never again. Never again would I be helpless. Never again would a lack of money be the reason my world ended. My 2 remaining sons would be armored in it. They would be protected by it. They would never, ever know the terror of that locked door. That vow became my religion. My life was no longer my own. It was a currency to be spent on their future. So began the 4 decades of my other life. The invisible life. I became a housekeeper and a nanny, a ghost flitting through the grand apartments of Manhattan's elite. My days began at 5 a.m., with the shriek of an alarm clock in the dark, the cold walk to the subway station in Queens, the long ride into the city, standing packed in with other ghosts, all of us tired before the day had even begun. My hands were my tools. They scrubbed marble floors in penthouses overlooking the park I could never afford to live near. They polished silver for dinner parties I would never be invited to. They washed and folded the clothes of other people's children, children who went to private schools, took ballet lessons, and never had to worry about the cost of a doctor. I raised those children while my own were latchkey kids, David looking after Mark, the 2 of them navigating a world that I was too busy cleaning to guide them through. I learned the habits of the rich. I saw their casual cruelties and their surprising kindnesses. I saw how money worked, how it moved, how it created moats around them, protecting them from the sharp edges of the world. And I listened. I paid attention. While I dusted their bookshelves, I read the titles of their finance books. While I served their drinks, I overheard conversations about stock tips and real estate investments. I was a sponge, absorbing a world I was not meant to be a part of. Every dollar I earned was a soldier in my secret war. I lived on almost nothing, patching my own clothes, eating the simplest of foods, denying myself every small comfort. The rest was for them. When David wanted to go to business school, I cashed in the small life insurance policy my husband had left. It wasn't enough. So I took on a second job, cleaning offices at night, working until my body screamed and my hands were raw and bleeding. He got his degree. He never asked how. He just accepted it as his due. When Mark showed a talent for math and science, I knew he had to be an engineer. His state university program was expensive. That meant more years of scrubbing, more weekends sacrificed, more nights falling into bed so exhausted I could barely move. He graduated with honors. He accepted my check for his first car with a casual thanks, Mom. I paid the down payment on David's first condo. I paid for his lavish wedding to Chelsea, a woman who looked at me then the same way she had looked at me tonight, like I was a piece of furniture that had been inexplicably misplaced. I paid for Mark's smaller, but still expensive, wedding. I was always there with the checkbook, the quiet, ever-reliable source of funding. The foundation upon which they built their successful, comfortable lives. They never questioned it. They never asked where the money came from. In their minds, I think it was simply there. Like the air they breathed. They saw me as Tessa, the housekeeper. A woman engaged in what they considered to be lowly, domestic work. They equated that work with low worth, and by extension, they equated me with low worth. It never occurred to them that the woman scrubbing floors could also be the woman signing checks for real estate deals in Brooklyn. It never occurred to them that a nanny could learn enough about the market to invest in a promising new restaurant venture 15 years ago. Their blindness was my shield. It allowed me to build my fortress in secret. I looked out the window of the terrace, my restaurant, my fortress. From this height, the city was beautiful, an abstraction of light and steel. You couldn't see the grime. You couldn't see the second-floor walk-ups in Queens or the crowded public clinics. You couldn't see the ghosts riding the subway at dawn. The irony was a bitter acid in my throat. I had built all this for them. I had spent my life constructing this armor of wealth so they would never feel the cold fear I had known. And what had they done with it? They had used its comfort and security as a platform from which to look down on me. They saw my life of service not as a sacrifice, but as my natural station. And now that they believed the well was dry, now that they thought the old woman had nothing left to give, they were ready to discard me. To put me in an affordable home. To lock me behind a door, just as surely as money had locked the door to my daughter's survival. My hand was steady as I lifted the water glass to my lips. The water was cold and clean. It tasted like victory. They had made a fatal miscalculation. They had forgotten the first rule of business, a lesson David should have learned in the school I paid for: never, ever underestimate your opponent. Especially when she's the one who holds all the cards. A waiter appeared at my side, moving with the silent, unobtrusive grace that was a hallmark of the terrace's training. He placed a small, complimentary amuse-bouche on the table, a single, perfectly seared scallop resting on a bed of saffron risotto. It was Antoine's way of saying hello, a small, reverent nod from the kitchen. I picked up the small silver fork. The movements were automatic, but my mind was miles away, back in the grime and the noise, back at the beginning of the blueprint. The vow I made over Ellen's body was the foundation. The decades of backbreaking work were the raw materials, but a pile of materials, no matter how large, is not a fortress. It must be built. For years, I was just stockpiling, stuffing cash into envelopes hidden in my mattress, opening savings accounts that earned a pittance in interest. I was saving, not building. I was still thinking like a poor woman, terrified of losing the little I had. The change came during a dinner party in a Fifth Avenue penthouse. I was in the kitchen, plating canapés, a ghost in a white apron. The host, a notoriously shrewd real estate mogul, was holding court in the adjoining library, his voice booming. He was laughing, a sound thick with expensive cognac and self-satisfaction. By the dirt, not the building, he'd bellowed to a younger man seeking his advice. Find the place no one wants. The broken down, the forgotten, the ugly. Buy it for pennies. Wait. The city always expands. The money always follows the need. Patience and a good contractor are the only two friends you need in this business. Something clicked into place in my mind with the force of a deadbolt sliding home. Patience. I had that. And a contractor? I'd spent my life fixing things other people had broken. I knew what it took to repair a leaky faucet, plaster a wall, sand a floor. I was my own contractor. The next day, I took the cash out of the mattress. It felt like a lifetime of pain converted into paper. I went to a part of Brooklyn that wasn't yet a brand name, a neighborhood where the word artisanal had never been spoken. It was all cracked sidewalks, boarded up storefronts, and a palpable sense of neglect. And there it was, a dilapidated two-family duplex, its windows like vacant eyes, a foreclosure notice taped to the door. It was ugly. It was forgotten. It was perfect. I bought it outright. The real estate agent, a man with a cheap suit and shifty eyes, could barely contain his glee at finding a sucker. He saw a simple, aging woman with a bag of cash. He didn't see the steel in my spine. That house became my secret obsession. My nights were no longer for cleaning other people's offices, they were for my own property. I learned how to do everything. I watched videos at the public library. I read DIY books. I tore out rotting floorboards with my own two hands, my old, familiar hands. I plastered walls, I laid tile, I painted until my arms felt like they would fall off. I hired professionals only for the plumbing and electrical, watching them, asking questions, learning. In 6 months, the derelict building was transformed into a clean, safe, respectable home. I rented both units to young families, charging a fair but firm price. And for the first time, money started to work for me. It wasn't a trickle, it was a stream. A steady, reliable flow that came in every month, whether I scrubbed a floor or not. It felt like a miracle. It felt like power. With the income from that first property, I bought another. A small apartment building in Jersey City, just across the river, in an area developers were only just beginning to whisper about. Then another. I was Tessa the housekeeper by day, a silent, unseen real estate investor by night. My portfolio grew quietly, brick by brick, deed by deed, a secret empire built in the shadows of the city I served. Then came Eli. He was a busboy at a restaurant where I did the overnight cleaning. I watched him for months. He worked harder than anyone else. He was the first to arrive, the last to leave. He treated the dishwashers with the same respect he showed the manager. He had a fire in his eyes, a hunger to build something. He reminded me of myself. When I overheard that he had a dream of opening his own place, a restaurant that treated its staff like family and its guests like royalty, I saw my next investment. It wasn't in property this time. It was in a person. I approached him one night, after closing, as I was mopping the floors. He was exhausted, counting out the day's meager tips. I made him an offer. I would provide the capital, all of it. He would provide the expertise and the labor. We would be partners. He looked at me, this cleaning woman in her worn-out shoes, and he didn't laugh. He saw something in my eyes that he recognized in his own. He saw the fire. That partnership became the terrace. Our crown jewel. And through all of it, my sons saw nothing. They lived in the world I had built for them, utterly oblivious to its architecture. And that was by design. Because early on, a terrible question had taken root in my heart, a question that kept me awake more than any financial worry. Was their love for me conditional? Did they see me, or did they see a utility? A resource? The soft place to land when they needed a down payment or a loan they never intended to repay. So I decided to run an experiment. A long, silent, 15-year experiment. I let them believe the narrative they had already written for me. I was Tessa, the simple housekeeper, the poor mother who had somehow, through scrimping and saving, managed to put them through school. I let them assume that well was now dry. I let them think I was broke, that I had nothing left to give but my time, which they valued at precisely 0. It was the most painful thing I have ever done. To sit at family dinners and listen to Chelsea talk about her struggles to find a good cleaning lady. To have David explain basic financial concepts to me in a slow, condescending tone, as if I were a child. To have Mark accept another check from me for car repairs and then hear nothing from him for 3 months. Every slight, every act of condescension, every moment of casual disregard was a piece of data. I was testing the hypothesis. I was stripping away the variable of my wealth to see what the core equation of our relationship truly was. I did it to find out who they were when they thought I had nothing. The answer was devastating. They were careless. They were dismissive. They were entitled. And ultimately, as their recent talk of the assisted living facility had proven, they were cruel. They weren't just neglecting me. They were planning my disposal. My invisibility had become an inconvenience they were now actively trying to solve by making me disappear entirely. The test was over. The results were in. And they were conclusive. They saw me as a liability. A line item on their budget of filial obligation that they were eager to minimize. They did not love me. They loved what I had provided. And now that they believed the provisions were gone, so was their affection. My gaze drifted across the dining room, back to the booth where my children sat. I could see them through a small gap in the curtain. They were no longer sitting in stunned silence. They were arguing. David was talking, his hands chopping the air in sharp, frantic gestures. Chelsea was shaking her head, her face a mask of fury. Mark was slumped in his seat, looking at his hands, a portrait of useless misery. They were trapped. They knew, on some primal level, that the ground beneath their feet had just given way. I had built their world. I had laid every foundation, paid for every brick. I had given them a life free of the fear that had haunted my own, and in return, they had tried to put me in a cage. A quiet smile touched my lips. I picked up the menu, its cover heavy, embossed leather. I didn't need to read it. I knew every dish, every ingredient, every price. I had approved them all. This place, this power, this was my answer to the locked door that had claimed my daughter. I had become the one who owned the building, the one who held the keys. My sons thought this was a family dinner. They were wrong. This was an audit. A final accounting of a lifetime of investment. And I, the silent, invisible, majority partner, was finally ready to call their moral debt due. I didn't order. I didn't need to. In a few moments, Eli would send over the white truffle risotto, followed by a small, perfectly cooked filet, and a glass of the Pinot Noir I favored. The rhythm of this place was an extension of my own will. I set my menu down and simply watched, a queen observing her court from behind a screen. The argument at their table was escalating. I couldn't hear the words, but the body language was a language I knew intimately. David's frantic, placating gestures. Chelsea's rigid fury, her arms crossed tight against her chest as if to hold herself together. Mark's pathetic, shrinking posture, wishing himself invisible. They were trapped in a gilded cage of their own making, and the horror was dawning on them that I was the one who had forged the bars. They were wrestling with a new reality, one in which the powerless woman they had planned to discard was the source of the very power they coveted. The air around their table was thick with recrimination and panic. It was a poison of their own brewing, and now they were being forced to drink it. It was time for the first lesson. I caught the eye of a passing sommelier, a young man named Jean-Pierre, whose education I had personally sponsored after he'd expressed a desire to become a master of his craft. He glided to my table instantly. "Miss Carter," he murmured, his voice a respectful hush. "How may I be of service?" "Jean-Pierre," I said, my voice calm and even. The family in the booth against the far wall. The party of 3. They look distressed. I think they could use a drink. My eyes drifted to the temperature-controlled cellar visible behind a wall of glass at the far end of the room. "Send them a bottle of the 2010 Chateau Margaux. With my compliments." Jean-Pierre's professionally neutral expression flickered for a nanosecond. He was a man who knew his vintages. A 2010 Margot wasn't just a bottle of wine, it was a statement. It was a liquid asset, a four-figure gesture of breathtaking magnanimity or devastating power, depending on the context. He knew the context. "Of course, Miss Carter," he said, with a slight bow. "On the house." "Precisely," I confirmed. "On the house." He turned and moved toward the cellar with the gravity of a man entrusted with state secrets. I watched as he selected the bottle, presented it to a waiter, and whispered instructions. I leaned back in my chair, the plush velvet cushioning my spine. The curtain was about to rise on the next act. The waiter approached their table with the careful deference reserved for the terrace's most valued patrons. He presented the bottle to David, whose eyes widened in disbelief as he read the label. I saw his lips form the word, Margot. He looked up, bewildered, scanning the room for some unseen benefactor, some client or banking colleague trying to impress him. It was an instinct born of his world. A gesture of this magnitude had to come from a man, from a peer, from someone whose power he recognized. The idea that it could come from the woman sitting 50 feet away was still, apparently, beyond the scope of his imagination. "Sir," the waiter said, his voice polite and clear. "A gift, from Miss Carter. On the house." The waiter gestured discreetly in my direction. 3 heads swiveled as one, 3 pairs of eyes locked onto me through the gap in the curtain. It was no longer shock on their faces. It was something else. A sickening, dawning comprehension. A confirmation of the impossible truth they had been trying to deny for the last 10 minutes. The silence that followed was different from the one that had followed my laughter. This was a silence born not of confusion, but of cold, hard clarity. The wine, the gesture, the phrase "on the house," it was all a language they understood perfectly. It was the language of ownership. David was the first to move. He pushed himself out of the booth, his movements stiff, robotic. He walked toward my table, each step seeming to require a colossal effort of will. Chelsea and Mark remained frozen, watching him like spectators at an execution. He stopped a few feet from my table, just outside the curtain's gossamer veil, a man standing on the threshold of a world he didn't know existed. Eli materialized at his side as if summoned from the very air, a silent, imposing guardian. "Sir," Eli said, his voice quiet but unyielding. "Miss Carter is not to be disturbed." David ignored him. His eyes were fixed on me, wide and pleading. "Mom?" he stammered. His voice was a reedy, unfamiliar thing. The confident baritone of the bank vice president had vanished, replaced by the uncertain quiver of a boy who had been caught doing something terribly wrong. What is this? What's going on?" I took a slow sip of water. I set the glass down with a soft, deliberate click. "I believe the term for it is dinner," I replied, my voice devoid of any warmth. "This place." He gestured vaguely, helplessly, at the opulent room. "The wine, Eli calling you Miss Carter. This is some kind of joke, right?" I finally looked up at him, meeting his gaze directly. "David," I said, and the sound of his name on my lips was flat, like a stone dropping into a deep well. "Does this look like a joke to you?" The truth, the whole, terrible, beautiful truth, was finally crashing down on him. The years of casual condescension, the assumption of his own superiority, the blindness to my reality, it was all coalescing into a single, unbearable moment of shame. You own this place?" he whispered, the question an admission of defeat. "I am the majority partner," I corrected him, the distinction important. "Eli and I built it together. From nothing. While you were getting your M.B.A. on my dime." He flinched as if I had struck him. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There were no words. What could he say? He had built his life on a foundation of my sacrifice, all while looking down on the very labor that had made his life possible. He, the man of finance, had failed to recognize the greatest asset in his life. This was the core of the lesson, the very heart of the disease I was now intent on curing. They had equated my work with my worth. In their world, a woman who scrubbed floors was a woman of no consequence. A housekeeper, a nanny, these were roles of servitude, not of power. They saw the apron, not the woman. They saw the tired hands, not the brilliant, strategic mind that was moving money, acquiring assets, and building an empire right under their noses. You saw a housekeeper, I said, my voice low and cutting, speaking the truth aloud for the first time. You saw a poor old woman to be managed and, eventually, discarded. It never occurred to you that the skills required to run a home, budgeting, logistics, tireless hard work, are the same skills required to run a business. You just couldn't see it. Your pride, your snobbery. It blinded you. I leaned forward slightly, my voice dropping even further, forcing him to strain to hear me. You and your wife, I said, the words like ice chips, were so busy looking down on me that you never thought to look at my balance sheet. David's face crumpled. The carefully constructed facade of the successful son, the powerful banker, disintegrated, revealing the terrified little boy beneath. He looked lost, utterly and completely adrift in a sea of his own making. Mom, I didn't know, he finally managed to say. No, I replied, the word of final, damning judgment. You didn't care. There's a difference. Eli put a firm but gentle hand on David's shoulder. I think it's time for you to return to your table, sir. David allowed himself to be led away, stumbling back to the booth like a man in a trance. I watched him go. There was no triumph in me. Only a profound and weary sadness. This wasn't a victory, it was a debridement, a painful but necessary cutting away of a diseased and rotten part of my life. The unmasking was complete. They now saw me for who I was. And in doing so, they were finally forced to see themselves for who they were. The reflection, I knew, was horrifying. David collapsed back into the booth, his movements devoid of their usual crisp authority. He looked like a puppet whose strings had been cut. From my vantage point, I could see Chelsea staring at him, her mouth a hard, thin line of fury. Her anger was no longer directed at me, it was now a venomous laser beam aimed at her husband. She was a creature of hierarchies, and her husband had just been revealed as a fool who had misjudged the most important power dynamic in his life. He had failed to secure the asset. In her world, this was an unforgivable sin. Mark just sat there, a ghost at the feast, staring at the untouched, obscenely expensive bottle of wine as if it were a bomb. The main course of their humiliation had been served. Now, it was time for dessert. I discreetly took out my phone, a simple, elegant model. My fingers moved across the screen with a speed and confidence that would have surprised my children, who always spoke to me as if technology were a mystical art I couldn't possibly comprehend. I had 2 numbers on speed dial under the heading action. One was for my lawyer. The other was for a man named Michael Chen. Michael was a pit bull in a bespoke suit. He ran a boutique PR firm, but his real talent lay in narrative warfare. I'd invested in his firm years ago, impressed by his ruthless efficiency. He understood that in a city like New York, perception wasn't just reality, it was currency. And my family's account was about to be declared bankrupt. I typed a short, simple text, the terrace. Now. I received an immediate reply, on my way. I put the phone away and took a bite of the risotto Eli had sent over. It was perfect. The earthy, pungent flavor of the white truffle exploded on my tongue. It was the taste of the earth, of things hidden and valuable, of treasures that had to be painstakingly unearthed. It was a fitting metaphor for the evening. For the next 20 minutes, I ate in silence. I savored every bite. I let them stew. I could feel their panic radiating across the room. A palpable, frantic energy. They were whispering now, heads huddled together over the table. They were trying to strategize, to find a way out of the checkmate I had placed them in. David kept glancing over at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading hope that I might relent, that this was all some elaborate, cruel lesson that would end with a forgiving maternal embrace. He still didn't understand. This wasn't a lesson. This was a verdict. Then, I saw them. Two figures appeared at the entrance, speaking in hushed tones with the hostess. The first was a woman with a sharp haircut, and the hungry, restless eyes of a journalist who smells blood in the water. I recognized her from page 6. The man with her held a small, professional-grade camera, the kind used by local news crews. NY1. Michael was efficient. Eli intercepted them immediately, his posture a polite but impenetrable wall. "Good evening," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I'm sorry, but we have a strict policy regarding press and cameras in the dining room." The reporter started to protest, but I had already risen from my chair. I drew back the silk curtain, stepping out of my alcove and into the full view of the dining room. The ambient noise faltered again as heads turned. My family froze, their whispered conference cut short. "It's quite all right, Eli," I said, my voice carrying across the space with practiced ease. "They're with me." Eli stepped aside without a word, a silent, loyal soldier following his commander's orders. The reporter's eyes widened, her professional instincts kicking into overdrive. This was better than she could have imagined. An inside job. I walked toward them, my heels making a soft, deliberate click on the marble floor. I met the reporter's gaze. "I believe you were told there was a story here," I said. "Miss Carter?" she asked, her voice a mix of surprise and professional eagerness. She knew my name. Of course, she did. Michael would have prepped her. "The one and only," I said with a thin smile. "And the story is sitting right over there." I gestured toward the booth, where my sons and daughter-in-law were now staring in abject horror. The sight of a camera had turned their panic into pure, unadulterated terror. This was no longer a private family drama. It was about to become public record. The reporter and her cameraman followed my gaze, their expressions a perfect blend of confusion and predatory glee. I led them toward the table, a slow procession of judgment. With every step, the carefully curated world of David and Chelsea Carter began to crumble. "Mom, no," David said, his voice cracking as we approached. He stood up, trying to block the camera's view, his hands held out in a gesture of frantic appeal. "Please. Don't do this." "Do what, David?" I asked, my voice cold and clear for the camera's microphone. "Tell the truth. I thought you, as a vice president at Hudson and Pacific Bank, were a man who valued transparency." Chelsea shot up from her seat, her face a kabuki mask of rage. "You have no right," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "This is a private matter." "Was it a private matter, Chelsea?" I countered, my tone conversational, "when you loudly suggested in a room full of people that I should go to a more affordable place? Was it a private matter when you and your husband made plans to move me into an assisted living facility against my will? You see, I believe once you try to publicly humiliate someone and strip them of their autonomy, it ceases to be a private matter. It becomes a matter of public interest." The reporter was scribbling furiously in her notepad, her eyes darting between us. The camera's red recording light was a malevolent, unblinking eye. "That's not true," David insisted, his voice rising in panic. "We were just concerned. For your welfare. We thought you were struggling." "Struggling," I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "That's a curious way to describe the woman who paid for your degree, your car, the down payment on your condo, and your wedding. Were those the actions of a struggling woman?" The reporter's head snapped toward David, her eyes widening. This was the angle. Riches to rags, but in reverse. The matriarch who had funded their lavish lifestyles, now being cast aside. It was a story tailor-made for public consumption and outrage. "You're twisting everything." Chelsea spat, trying to salvage the situation. She turned to the reporter, forcing a smile that was a grotesque parody of her usual social grace. "My mother-in-law is confused. She's been under a lot of stress. We love her very much." This is all a terrible misunderstanding. Damage control. It was a pathetic, transparent attempt, and it was about to backfire spectacularly. I am not confused, Chelsea, I said, my voice dropping to a steely calm. My memory is, in fact, excellent. I remember the exact phrasing you used. I remember the sneer on your face. And I also remember the paperwork your husband asked me to sign last month, a durable power of attorney that would have given you complete control over my assets. The assets you didn't even know existed. Was that part of your concern for my welfare? To gain legal control over the finances of a woman you believed to be destitute? The camera zoomed in on Chelsea's face. The fake smile dissolved, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated panic. She had been caught. The reporter's pen was flying across her notepad. Mark, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. "Mom, please," he whispered, his voice thick with shame. Let's go home and talk about this." "Home?" I asked, turning my attention to my younger son. "Whose home, Mark?" "The condo I helped you buy." "Or are you referring to the assisted living facility you agreed was a practical solution for me? You were always the quiet one. I used to think it was a sign of thoughtfulness. I realize now it was simply the sound of your complicity." I turned back to the reporter, the final, public unmasking complete. They thought my life of service meant I was a servant. They enjoyed the fruits of my labor while despising the labor itself. They built their comfortable lives on my aching back, and when my back grew tired, they decided it was time to put me out to pasture. "The only mistake they made," I said, my gaze sweeping over all three of them, a silent, final condemnation, "was assuming I was as weak as they thought I was." I gave the reporter a final, decisive nod. "I believe you have your story." I didn't wait for their response. There was nothing more to say. The narrative was no longer mine to control, it belonged to the ether now, to the insatiable, 24-hour news cycle of the digital age. I gave a final, dismissive glance at the wreckage of my family, turned my back, and walked away. Eli was waiting for me, holding my sable coat. He draped it over my shoulders with a quiet solemnity, a gesture that felt both protective and final. I did not look back. Behind me, I could hear the reporter's sharp, incisive questions beginning, a barrage that David and Chelsea were in no way equipped to handle. Their world of polite lies and carefully managed appearances was being publicly dismantled, one devastating question at a time. The drive back to my apartment, my real home, a quiet, comfortable penthouse in a building I owned on the Upper West Side, a place they had never seen, was silent. Eli drove. He didn't speak, respecting the gravity of the moment. The city lights streamed past the windows, a river of glittering possibilities. For the first time in a long time, they looked like my possibilities, not theirs. I felt no triumph. No glee. Just the cold, clean, and utterly exhausting feeling of a necessary amputation. I had cut away the rot to save myself. The phantom limb of my family still ached, but the relief was profound. The story broke before I had even finished my first cup of chamomile tea. Michael Chen was, as always, brutally effective. He hadn't just given the story to Page 6 and NY1. He had packaged it. He provided a succinct, explosive summary and a high-resolution clip, the 30-second segment of my final, damning monologue, to every major news outlet, blog, and social media aggregator in the city. He had engineered a firestorm. By morning, it was everywhere. The clip was the perfect viral artifact for the modern age. Short, shocking, and emotionally potent. It had everything. The opulent setting of the terrace providing a backdrop of unimaginable wealth. The image of a poised, elegant, elderly woman calmly and methodically dismantling her well-heeled, entitled children. The raw, unfiltered shame on their faces. It was a morality play for the Instagram era. It flooded X, formerly Twitter, under hashtags that trended globally: number terrace takedown, number invisible mother, number Tessa Carter. On TikTok, creators stitched the clip, adding their own commentary, dramatic music, and reenactments. The story was sliced, diced, and remixed into 1,000 different pieces of content, but the central theme was always the same: elder dignity, filial ingratitude, and the spectacular fall of the entitled elite. Public outrage was a tidal wave, swift and merciless. I became an overnight folk hero, an avatar for every person who had ever felt unseen, unappreciated, or underestimated. They didn't just see a rich woman fighting with her rich children, they saw their own mothers, their grandmothers. They saw the quiet sacrifices, the years of thankless labor, the pain of being taken for granted. My story became their story. For David and Chelsea, the fallout was catastrophic. Their world was built on the fragile scaffolding of reputation and social standing. In a matter of hours, that scaffolding was reduced to ash. Hudson and Pacific Bank, where David was a vice president, was a deeply conservative institution that valued discretion above all else. A viral video of one of their executives being publicly accused of attempting to defraud his own mother was not just an embarrassment. It was a liability. Their phones began ringing off the hook with calls from reporters and angry clients. By 10 a.m. the next morning, they had issued a terse statement announcing that David Carter had been suspended, pending an internal investigation. The investigation was a formality. He was a dead man walking. 2 days later, a courier delivered a box to his condo containing the contents of his desk. He was fired. The career I had funded, the one that was his entire identity, had been extinguished. Chelsea's world imploded with even greater speed. The Upper East Side social circle she had so desperately cultivated iced her out completely. Invitations to charity galas and weekend brunches evaporated. Her phone calls went unanswered. In her world, scandal wasn't a tragedy, it was a social contagion, and no one wanted to risk infection. The part-time job she held at a prestigious Soho art gallery, a position that was more about status than salary, was the first casualty. The gallery owner, a woman who prided herself on her progressive image, called Chelsea personally to inform her that her services were no longer required. Her presence, she was told, had become a distraction. She was a pariah. The very people she had tried to impress by sneering at me were now the ones casting her out. The irony was so perfect, so complete, it was almost poetic. Mark, my quiet, complicit Mark, thought he could escape the worst of it. He wasn't a banker or a socialite. He was an engineer, a man who dealt in facts and figures, not public perception. He made a fatal error in judgment. He tried to apologize. He posted a video to his Instagram. It was a masterclass in how not to handle a crisis. He filmed it in his stark, minimalist apartment, the one I had helped him secure, his face pale and strained. He spoke in a halting, insincere monotone, reading from a script that was clearly written by a lawyer. He talked about misunderstandings and complex family dynamics. He said he loved his mother and that things had been taken out of context. He never once took responsibility. He never once admitted to his own role in the plan to have me institutionalized. The internet eviscerated him. The comments section was a digital firing squad. He was called a coward, a gaslighter, a spineless accomplice. The video, intended to quell the flames, acted as an accelerant. It became a meme for insincere apologies. The final, most personal blow came from his girlfriend, a smart, independent young woman I had always liked. She had apparently seen the video, and the original clip, and had come to her own conclusions. She broke up with him via text message, a brutally efficient the final blow. "I can't be with a man who would do that to his own mother," the message reportedly read, a detail that was, of course, immediately leaked to the press. They were in a free fall, their lives unraveling in real time, on a global stage. They had lost their jobs, their social standing, their relationships. The comfortable world I had built for them had proven to be a house of cards, and a single breath of truth had blown it all away. I watched it all unfold from the quiet of my apartment. I read the articles, I saw the hashtags, I watched the TikToks. Michael sent me a summary every morning, a neat, bullet-pointed list of my children's ongoing destruction. There was a grim satisfaction in it, I could not deny that. But it wasn't joy. It was the detached, dispassionate feeling of a scientist observing the predictable results of a chemical reaction. They had mixed arrogance with cruelty. The explosion was inevitable. They thought the public humiliation was the end of it. They thought that once the trending topics faded and the news cycle moved on, they could begin to rebuild. They still didn't understand the nature of the game we were playing. The public fallout was merely the distraction, the loud, flashy explosion designed to draw their attention. The real work, the structural demolition of their lives, was happening silently, behind the scenes. And that was a battle they had no hope of winning. Because the architect of their lives was now the architect of their reckoning. The digital firestorm was the noise, the loud and satisfying clang of a bell announcing a new world order. But noise fades. Hashtags die. The public's outrage, while gratifying, is a fickle and fleeting thing. I had not built my life's work on anything so flimsy as public opinion, and I would not build my reclamation on it either. The public humiliation was the air cover. The real work, the ground assault, was done in the quiet, methodical world of contracts, titles, and banking codes. 2 days after the dinner at the terrace, while my children were still reeling from the initial shockwave of their public disgrace, I was sitting in a quiet conference room downtown. The room was the antithesis of the terrace. There was no velvet or gold leaf, only dark mahogany, worn leather, and the hushed, reassuring scent of old books and older money. This was the office of Ezekiel Zeke Moore, the only lawyer I had ever trusted. Zeke was a man carved from granite, with a mind like a steel trap and a loyalty that was absolute. He had handled the legal framework for every property I'd ever bought, every business I'd ever invested in. He knew where every body was buried because he had helped me dig the graves. Spread across the vast mahogany table between us was the architecture of my life. Deeds, trust documents, LLC charters, bank statements. It was a paper fortress, and we were about to pull up the drawbridge. The public phase was executed flawlessly, Tessa, Zeke said, his voice a low rumble. He peered at a document through his reading glasses. Michael Chen certainly earned his fee. But this is the end game. They think the public shame is the extent of their punishment, I said, my voice even. They're sitting in that condo right now, waiting for the storm to pass, thinking they can just ride it out. They have no idea the ground beneath them is about to liquefy. Zeke allowed himself a rare, thin smile. They never saw the real structure, did they? They were living in the penthouse but never bothered to look at the building's foundation. He slid a binder across the table to me. Let's review. The first section was titled Discretionary Support Streams. For the last 10 years, I had been transferring money to my sons every month. It wasn't a gift sent from my personal account with a note. It was far more subtle. I had established a nondescript LLC with a name like Mid-Atlantic Logistical Solutions. From that LLC's business account, a monthly consulting fee was paid into each of their accounts. To them, it was just a silent, mysterious deposit they never questioned. It was enough to cover their car payments, their property taxes, their country club dues. It was the invisible subsidy that made their lavish lifestyles possible, the financial cushion that allowed them to live perpetually beyond their means without a single moment of worry. It was the money that paid for Chelsea's gallery hopping and David's bespoke suits. They thought their salaries covered it all. They were fools. The transfers, I said, my voice flat. It was not a question. A simple automated payment, Zeke confirmed. From an account they cannot trace back to you. Easily terminated. All it requires is your signature. He pushed a form toward me. My signature was a crisp, definitive black line. The first pillar of their financial lives had just been vaporized. They wouldn't even know it was gone until the 1st of next month, when their accounts would be significantly lighter. Next, Zeke said, turning a page. Assets. This was the master stroke, the cornerstone of my entire secret strategy, the ultimate contingency plan I had put in place years ago, born of that cold, hard vow I made in a damp Queens apartment. David's condo, Zeke stated, tapping a thick file. And his car. The title for the Mercedes remains with one of your holding companies. He has possession and use, but not ownership. He's been driving your car. My lips tightened. The car I'd bought him to celebrate a promotion he'd only gotten because he had the right pedigree, a pedigree I had purchased for him. And the condo? I asked, though I knew the answer. Even better, Zeke said, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. You purchased it through a revocable trust. You named him as the sole beneficiary, which allowed him to live there, to claim residency, to present it to the world as his own. But you, Tessa, remained the trustee. The power to revoke his beneficiary status, and thus his right to the property, has always been, and remains, entirely yours. He doesn't own his home. He has been a guest, a long-term tenant who has just violated the terms of his lease. I had given them the illusion of ownership, the trapping of success. But I had never let go of the keys, I had never relinquished control. It was a secret safety net, woven from distrust and painful experience. I had hoped I would never have to use it. But they had forced my hand. Prepare the paperwork, I said. For the car and the condo. Begin the reclamation. Zeke simply nodded, making a note. We spent another hour reviewing the smaller assets, the investment accounts I had seeded for them, the insurance policies where I was listed as the payor. One by one, I severed the ties. I cut the cords. I dismantled, with a few strokes of a pen, the entire financial infrastructure of their lives. When it was done, I sat back. The air in the room felt lighter. I was no longer a silent benefactor. I was just me. The summons was delivered by courier that evening. A single, formal letter from Zeke's office, requesting their presence at a meeting the following afternoon. The location was not my home, and not Zeke's office. It was the presidential suite of the Mandarin Oriental Hotel. A place of stunning, impersonal luxury overlooking the park. It was neutral ground, but it was ground I controlled. I was not inviting them into my life. I was summoning them to a boardroom. They arrived, looking like survivors of a shipwreck. David's expensive suit was rumpled, his face pale and unshaven. Chelsea, stripped of her social armor, looked smaller, her eyes red-rimmed and filled with a venomous, terrified rage. Mark just looked broken. They stood in the center of the vast suite, dwarfed by the floor-to-ceiling windows and the commanding view of the city. I sat in an armchair, a teacup resting in my hand. Zeke stood silently by the window. What is this? David began, his voice raspy. Some kind of power play? To humiliate us even more? This is not a humiliation, David, I said, my voice quiet, cutting through his bluster. This is a severance. It's a termination of a contract you breached. We're your family, not your employees. Chelsea spat, her voice trembling. My employees show me more respect than you have, I replied without looking at her. I turned my gaze to David. The monthly deposits you've been receiving from Mid-Atlantic Logistical Solutions will cease, effective immediately. 1. His face went blank. What? What are you talking about? The stipend, David, I said calmly. The money that has been propping up your life for a decade. It's gone. Comprehension dawned, followed by a wave of sickening horror. He stumbled back a step. That was from you? Everything, I said, the word landing with the weight of a tombstone. Was from me. I let the silence stretch, letting the full implication of their dependency sink in. Then, I delivered the final blows. Zeke will be in touch regarding the Mercedes. A representative from my company will be by to collect it tomorrow, and as for the condo, the trust has been amended. You are no longer the beneficiary. You have 30 days to vacate the property. This time, it was Chelsea who gasped, a raw, wounded sound. You can't. You can't throw us out. Where will we go? 1. That is no longer my concern, I said. You were so eager to find me an affordable living situation. I am confident you will now apply that same resourcefulness to your own. They began to beg then. It was a pathetic, ugly torrent of excuses, blame, and desperate pleas. David blamed Chelsea. Chelsea blamed David's weakness. Mark mumbled apologies into his chest. They promised to change. They swore they loved me. They tried to cry. It was a performance, and a poor one at that. They weren't sorry for what they had done. They were terrified of the consequences. I listened, my expression unchanging, until they had exhausted themselves. When their pathetic chorus of pleas finally died down, I set my teacup down. You are correct about one thing, I said, rising from my chair. This is a power play. Because power is the only language you seem to understand. The old terms of our engagement are over. The bank of Mom is closed. The free ride has come to a grinding, permanent halt. I walked to the window, looking down at the city below. My city. I am going to offer you a choice, I said, not turning to look at them. Not out of love, not anymore, but out of a flicker of some residual memory of the boys I once raised. You can walk out that door right now, with nothing but the clothes on your backs, and face the world you are so ill-equipped to handle. Or, you can stay. You can listen. And you can accept my new terms. Unconditionally. I turned back to them. Their faces were a ruin of tear-streaked desperation. They were trapped, and they knew it. The life they knew was gone. The only path forward, the only hope of survival, led directly through me. What terms? David whispered, his voice broken. I gave them a cold, hard smile. The terms of your reckoning. Their silence was its own answer. To walk out that door was to step off a cliff into a world they had never truly known, a world without a safety net. The terror in their eyes was an admission of their complete and utter dependence on the very person they had disdained. They would stay. They would listen. They had no other choice. But before I laid out the terms of their new reality, I had one more card to play. The public narrative had been shaped by a 30-second video clip and my subsequent statement. It was powerful, but it was still my word against their frantic, insincere denials. The digital world that had made me a temporary hero could just as easily turn on me, swayed by a well-crafted sob story about a misunderstood family and a vindictive, wealthy matriarch. I needed to inoculate myself against that possibility. I needed to control the narrative, not just for a news cycle, but permanently. I needed to show the world the receipts. Before we discuss your future, I said, my voice cutting through the funereal silence of the hotel suite, we need to have a moment of absolute clarity about the past. I gestured to Zeke. He opened a slim briefcase and removed a small, sleek digital audio recorder, placing it on the coffee table between us. It was an innocuous-looking object, but it held a decade's worth of their own words, a meticulously curated archive of their contempt. For years, I had carried a small, high-quality recorder in my purse, activated with a simple, silent touch. It had started not as a tool for entrapment, but as a tool for my own sanity. I began recording our conversations after a particularly cruel comment from Chelsea about my housekeeper hands that she later denied, gaslighting me into believing I had imagined it. I started recording so I could listen back in the quiet of my own home and confirm that I was not, in fact, going crazy. I needed proof, if only for myself, that the 1,000 tiny cuts of their disrespect were real. Over the years, that collection of audio files had become something else entirely. It had become an unassailable record of the truth. What is that? Chelsea asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. A record, I said simply. Of conversations you seem to have forgotten. Let me refresh your memory. Zeke pressed a button. The first audio file played, the sound crisp and clear in the quiet room. It was Chelsea's voice, from a phone call a year prior. Honestly, David, she's becoming a liability. Did you see the coat she wore to the brunch? It was mortifying. People are starting to ask questions. We need to get her finances in order before she ends up a ward of the state and it reflects poorly on us. We need to get control. David flinched as if he'd been physically struck. Chelsea's face went bone-white. Zeke played the next clip. This one was from Mark, a voicemail he'd left for David, thinking he was speaking privately. "Yeah, I got the check from Mom for the roof leak. Easiest $5,000 I ever made. She didn't even ask to see a receipt. Seriously, it's like taking candy from a baby. As long as you sound pathetic enough, she'll write a check for anything." Mark let out a small, strangled groan and sank into one of the plush sofas, covering his face with his hands. The next clip was a recording of a family dinner from 6 months ago, the recorder resting innocently in my purse on the chair beside me. It was a conversation about the assisted living facility. David's voice: "It's the most practical solution. It's affordable, it's clean, and most importantly, it's out of the way. We can visit on major holidays. It'll be better for everyone, she'll be safe, and we'll have our peace of mind." Chelsea's voice, sharp and practical. "And once we have power of attorney, we can sell her old apartment in Queens to cover the first few years of fees. It's a clean break. No more last-minute calls, no more financial drains. It's just simpler." Zeke stopped the recording. The silence that filled the room was absolute, suffocating. There was no room for denial. No space for misunderstanding or claims of being taken out of context. It was all there, in their own voices, in their own words. The casual cruelty. The financial scheming. The cold, practical planning of my disposal. It was the sound of their own moral bankruptcy. "That," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, "is just a small sample. I have hundreds of hours of this. Voicemails. Phone calls. Dinner conversations. Every condescending remark, every financial lie, every detail of your plan to put me away and liquidate what you thought were my meager assets. It's all documented." I let that sink in. I let them contemplate the reality of a decade of their private, ugly thoughts being laid bare. "For years, you controlled the story of my life," I continued. "You painted me as the simple, slightly dotty, financially inept mother who needed your guidance. You gaslit me, you dismissed me, and you rewrote history to suit your own needs. That ends today. From now on, I will be the one telling my story." I looked at Zeke. "It's time." He nodded, pulling out a laptop. With a few clicks, he navigated to a web page that had just gone live. He turned the screen so they could see it. It was a YouTube channel. The design was clean, elegant, and professional. The name of the channel was simply, The Tessa Carter Project. And there was only one video, uploaded just minutes ago, titled, Receipts, Part 1, on Affordable Solutions. The video began. It was a simple, powerful production. It opened with the now infamous clip from the terrace, then seamlessly transitioned to a shot of me, sitting in this very suite, looking directly into the camera. My voiceover began, calm and steady, as the audio clip of their conversation about the assisted living facility played, accompanied by a scrolling transcript on the screen. "My children say they were concerned for my welfare," my recorded voice said over the audio of their scheming. This is what their concerns sounded like in private. The video was 5 minutes long. It was devastating. It was unassailable. "This video," I told them, my voice like steel, "is now live. It has been sent to every news outlet that covered the initial story. It has been posted to every social media platform. By the time you leave this room, it will have been viewed tens of thousands of times. By the end of the day, it will be in the millions." This was the final checkmate. It wasn't just about winning a family argument. It was about seizing control of the public narrative in a way that was absolute and irreversible. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a narrator. A witness to my own life. "You have spent your entire lives embarrassed by me," I said, my gaze sweeping over their shattered faces. "Ashamed of my work, ashamed of my simple clothes, ashamed of where I came from. You tried to make me invisible. Well, I am about to become the most visible I have ever been. The plan had been Michael Chen's brainchild, executed with Zeke's legal precision. We would not be reactive, we would be proactive. We would not grant interviews to others, we would become the source. The YouTube channel was just the beginning. I have already received offers, I continued, a fact that was entirely true. The moment the first story broke, my name had become a hot commodity. Morning shows. A segment on CNN. 2 independent production companies have already pitched documentary ideas. A publisher has inquired about a memoir. I have, it seems, become a national symbol of elder dignity. I let a small, cold smile touch my lips. The story is no longer about a family squabble in a fancy restaurant. The story is now about a woman who built an empire in secret while the world, and her own family, underestimated her. It's about the invisible women, the housekeepers, the nannies, the caregivers whose labor makes the world run, but who are never truly seen. I have been given a voice, a platform. And I intend to use it. The narrative had flipped, decisively and permanently, in my favor. They were no longer just entitled children, they were now the antagonists in a story of national interest. Any attempt to fight back, to sue, to smear me, would be futile. How could they? I had the receipts. I had the recordings. Any legal challenge they mounted would trigger the release of more audio, more proof of their deception, turning a legal battle into a public crucifixion. They were utterly, completely disarmed. Stripped of their money, their homes, their reputations, and now, even their ability to tell their own lies. I walked back to my chair and sat down, picking up my teacup. The warmth of the porcelain was a small, steady comfort. The old world is gone, I said, my voice softening, not with pity, but with the quiet finality of a judge delivering a life sentence. Your lives as you knew them are over. But I am, in spite of everything, still your mother, and that leaves me with one final, burdensome obligation, to teach you the lessons you have so spectacularly failed to learn. I looked at their broken, terrified faces. They were finally ready to listen. Now, I said, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. Let us discuss the terms of your reckoning. The YouTube video played out on Zeke's laptop, the sound of their own voices, their own treachery filling the opulent suite. When it ended, a profound and heavy silence descended. It was the silence of a tomb, the silence of a life that had just been irrevocably buried. They didn't speak. They couldn't. Every lie, every possible defense, had been preemptively dismantled. They were stripped bare, not just of their assets, but of their very narrative. I had left them with nothing but the ugly, unvarnished truth of who they were. I placed my teacup carefully back on its saucer. The small clink of porcelain against porcelain was the only sound, a sharp, definitive punctuation mark at the end of their old lives. These terms. I began, my voice calm and measured, a surgeon outlining a complex and painful procedure, are not a negotiation. They are not a suggestion. They are the conditions of your continued, albeit vastly different, existence under my purview. You will accept every single one, without argument or amendment. The alternative is excommunication, complete and total severance. You will be left with nothing but the consequences you have so richly earned. Do you understand? 3 heads nodded in unison, their movements jerky and puppet-like. They were broken, and in their brokenness, they were finally compliant. Good, I said. Zeke slid a portfolio across the table. It wasn't a contract for them to sign. They had lost all rights to be a party to any agreement. It was a list, a blueprint for their penance. First, I stated, my eyes locking onto each of them in turn. The apology. I saw a flicker of something, perhaps relief in David's eyes. An apology was easy, words were cheap. He was about to learn that my price was much higher. You will not be apologizing to me in private, I continued. Your betrayal was public, and your atonement will be as well. You will record a new video. All 3 of you. In it, you will not speak of misunderstandings or complex dynamics. You will name your specific harms. David, you will state, on camera, that you attempted to gain power of attorney over my assets for your own financial gain. Chelsea, you will admit that you sought to have me institutionalized to simplify your life and remove what you perceived as a social and financial burden. Mark, you will confess that you knowingly and repeatedly lied to me to extract money that you had not earned and did not deserve. You will detail the lies. You will be specific. You will be honest. For the first time in your adult lives. I let that sink in. This was not about saving face. This was about the ritualistic destruction of their public-facing personas, the very identities they valued above all else. It was about replacing their lies with a truth so stark and humiliating it could never be undone. Second, I said, moving on before they could fully process the first command. Repayment. This time, the sound was a collective, sharp intake of breath. You have lived your lives on my investments, I said, my voice as cold and hard as a banker's ledger. An investment requires a return. Zeke has prepared a full accounting of every significant expenditure I have made on your behalf since you turned 18. Every tuition payment. The down payments for your condos. The full cost of your cars. The extravagant weddings. The so-called loans that were never repaid. The total, with a modest interest rate compounded over the years, comes to approximately $800,000. You will repay it. All of it. How? David croaked, the single word, a testament to his new reality. We have no jobs. No money. You've taken everything. No. I have not taken everything, I corrected him. I have merely reclaimed what was mine. I am, however, providing you with an opportunity to earn. Which brings me to term number 3, employment. I paused, allowing the faintest, cruelest glimmer of hope to enter their minds. Perhaps I would place them in comfortable, mid-level positions in one of my companies. An administrative role, something to tide them over. I quickly extinguished it. You have always viewed my life's work, the physical labor that funded your pedigrees, with contempt, I said. It is time for you to gain a more intimate understanding of it. David, your experience in banking is over. Your new position is with the janitorial crew at the corporate headquarters of one of my real estate ventures. Your former peers from Hudson and Pacific can watch you mop the lobby floors they walk across every day. You will learn the dignity of a job well done, even when no one is watching. David's face was ashen. He looked like he was going to be sick. I turned to his wife. Chelsea, your days of curating art are finished. Your new position is in the kitchens of the terrace. You will not be a hostess. You will not be a manager. You will be on the prep line. You will spend 12 hours a day scrubbing pans, peeling vegetables, and learning what it feels like to have burns and blisters on your hands. You will learn the cost of the food you so casually dismissed. Chelsea stared at me, her mouth opening and closing silently, a fish drowning in air. Mark, I said, my gaze softening almost imperceptibly before hardening again. You are an engineer. You understand how things are built. You will now learn how they are maintained. You will join the property maintenance team for my residential buildings in Queens and Jersey City. You will patch drywall. You will fix leaking boilers. You will learn the names of the tools not from a textbook, but by the calluses they raise on your hands. I let the vision of their new lives settle over them, a thick, suffocating shroud. The humiliation was the point. It was the tool. The labor itself wasn't the punishment, the descent was. Fourth, I continued, my voice relentless. Lifestyle adjustment. You will vacate your condos. You will move into modest, 2-bedroom rental apartments in Astoria, Queens. The same neighborhood where your father and I began our lives. The same neighborhood where your sister died. You will learn to live on the salaries you earn from your new jobs. You will budget. You will do without. You will experience the world from the other side of the velvet rope. And there are 2 final conditions to this new life. You will attend mandatory therapy, both individually and as a family. You will unpack the rot of entitlement that I, admittedly, had a hand in creating. And you will each volunteer, for 10 hours a week, at the Queen's Senior Center. You will spend your weekends not at brunches or in the Hamptons, but playing chess with men forgotten by their children, listening to the stories of women who have no one else to tell them to. You will learn to see the elderly not as burdens to be managed, but as human beings to be valued. I paused, taking a sip of my now cold tea. I had laid out the blueprint of their prison. Now, for the bars. Finally, I said, my voice dropping. The inheritance. This got their attention. In the deepest, most reptilian part of their brains, there was still a flicker of hope that this was all a temporary, theatrical punishment, and that one day, the vast fortune I had accumulated would still be theirs. There is no inheritance, I said, the words a final nail in the coffin of their former lives. You will sign legally binding documents, prepared by Zeke, relinquishing any and all future claims to my estate. Every penny, every property, every stock certificate will go to the Invisible Mothers Foundation, a new charitable organization I am establishing to provide legal aid, financial stipends, and support for elderly women who have been victims of financial abuse and neglect. Your legacy, the one you would have inherited, will now be used to protect other women from people like you. I stood up. The meeting concluded. There is one last detail. Zeke has copies of all the audio recordings. Should you deviate from these terms in any way, if you shirk your duties, if you attempt any form of manipulation, if you so much as breathe a word of complaint to the wrong person, another video will be released. And another. And another, after that. I have enough material to keep you infamous for the rest of your lives. You are not just on probation with me. You are on probation with the world. And I hold the keys to your cage. I walked toward the door of the suite, Zeke following silently behind me. I stopped at the threshold and looked back at the 3 broken figures I had once called my children. Your new lives begin tomorrow, I said. Apartment keys and work assignments will be delivered to you in the morning. I suggest you get a good night's sleep. You're going to need it. With that, I walked out, leaving them alone in the vast, silent suite, with nothing but the view of a city that was no longer theirs and the terrifying, non-negotiable terms of their reckoning. The first month was an exercise in pure shock. Reality, stripped of all its former comforts, was a brutally cold and abrasive thing. The carefully constructed artifice of their lives had not just been dismantled, it had been detonated, and they were left sifting through the rubble, trying to comprehend the shape of their new existence. Humiliation was the air they breathed, a thick, ever-present smog that choked them with every step. For David, the descent was the most visibly public. His new uniform was not a bespoke Zegna suit but a plain gray jumpsuit with the logo of the property management company stitched on the chest. His office was no longer a glass-walled corner suite on the 40th floor but a cramped janitor's closet in the basement of the very building where he once had a 7-figure credit line. His days, which had once been a blur of conference calls, client lunches, and market analyses, now had a simple, grinding rhythm. Mop, bucket, buffer. Trash, recycle, repeat. The first time he saw a former colleague, it almost broke him. It was a senior partner from Hudson and Pacific, a man David had once considered a mentor. The man strode into the gleaming marble lobby, barking into his phone, his polished Italian shoes clicking with a sound of importance David knew intimately. He didn't even see David, who was on his hands and knees, scrubbing a coffee stain from the grout between the tiles. To this man, David was just part of the scenery, a faceless, gray-clad phantom. The invisibility he and his wife had tried to impose on me was now his own daily reality. He was no one. A ghost haunting the halls of his former power. He went home that night to the cramped Astoria apartment, his hands aching, the smell of industrial cleaner clinging to his skin, and he wept. They were not the crocodile tears of the hotel suite. They were the raw, ragged sobs of a man who had lost his entire identity. He had defined himself by his job, his title, his income. Without them, he didn't know who he was. Chelsea's hell was hotter, louder, and smelled perpetually of scorched onions and fish stock. The pristine, climate-controlled art galleries were a distant memory, replaced by the chaotic, sweat-soaked inferno of the terrace's kitchen. Chef Antoine, at my quiet instruction, had shown her no mercy. She was at the bottom of a brutal, unforgiving hierarchy. Her manicured nails were gone in the first week, broken and stained. Her designer clothes were replaced by a stained white chef's jacket and non-slip clogs. Her first task, every single morning for a month, was to peel and brunoise 50 pounds of onions. Tears streamed down her face, but they weren't from emotion. They were from the sulfurous, acidic burn. She was then promoted to the dish pit, the lowest circle of the kitchen's inferno. For 12 hours a day, she stood in the steam and the noise, wrestling with greasy pans and lipstick-stained wine glasses, her hands perpetually raw and chapped from the scalding water and harsh detergents. The other line cooks, a tough, motley crew from every corner of the world, called her gallery, their voices laced with a mixture of amusement and contempt. She had once sent back a dish here because the sauce had been improperly broken. Now, she was scrubbing the very pan that sauce had been made in. She tried to quit, once. In the second week, she threw down a scouring pad, her face contorted with rage and disgust, and stormed out the back alley. She got as far as the corner before the reality of her situation hit her. Where would she go? What would she do? She had no money, no job, no social standing. Walking away meant stepping into the abyss. Defeated, she walked back into the kitchen's oppressive heat, picked up the scouring pad, and said nothing. The other cooks pretended not to have noticed. Her surrender was a private, bitter pill. Mark's punishment was quieter, more solitary, but no less profound. His work took him into the guts of the buildings I owned, the unglamorous, hidden spaces that made comfortable lives like his former one possible. He wrestled with ancient boilers in damp basements, patched the cracked and water-stained ceilings of tenants who had been complaining for months, and snake drains clogged with other people's filth. He, the engineer who had designed complex systems on a computer screen, was now faced with the messy, unpredictable reality of entropy. Things broke. They leaked. They failed. His job was to fix them. He was clumsy at first, his hands unused to the raw torque of a pipe wrench or the delicate art of plastering. He made mistakes. He got shocked by faulty wiring. He was cursed at by frustrated tenants. The humiliation for him was not public, but deeply internal. He had always prided himself on his intelligence, on his ability to solve problems. But he quickly learned that theoretical knowledge was useless when faced with a stripped bolt or a burst pipe at 2 in the morning. He had to learn by doing, by failing, by asking for help from the grizzled, older superintendents who had forgotten more about practical mechanics than he had ever known. These men he would have previously considered his inferiors, became his teachers. They showed him how to sweat a pipe, how to find a stud in a wall, how to listen to the sound of a failing furnace and diagnose its ailment. They taught him a different kind of knowledge, one written in calluses and grease stains. It was the humiliation, more than the labor, that was the true crucible. It was the daily, grinding erosion of their former selves. It was the loss of status, the stripping away of every external signifier of their worth. They were no longer David Carter, VP, Chelsea Carter, socialite, and Mark Carter, engineer. They were the janitor, the prep cook, and the handyman. And yet, in the midst of this relentless demolition, something unexpected began to happen. Tiny, almost imperceptible cracks started to appear in the hard shells of their entitlement. For David, it happened late one night. He was buffing the lobby floors, the machine humming its monotonous song, when an elderly cleaning woman on his crew, a woman from El Salvador named Maria, offered him a cup of coffee from her thermos. She didn't speak much English, and he spoke no Spanish, but she smiled, a genuine, tired smile, and gestured to a bench. For 15 minutes, they sat in silence, drinking the sweet, milky coffee. She showed him a worn photo of her grandchildren. He, for the first time, felt a pang of connection to another human being that wasn't based on status or utility. She saw him not as a disgraced banker, but as a man with a tired back, just like her. It was a moment of simple, unadorned grace. For Chelsea, it came during a brutal dinner service. A pot of boiling stock had slipped, scalding her arm. The pain was sharp and searing. Before she could even cry out, the tough-as-nails line cook who had been tormenting her for weeks was at her side, gently running her arm under cold water, barking at someone to get the first aid kit. He treated the burn with a practiced, gentle efficiency, then looked her in the eye. "You okay, Gallery?" he asked, and for the first time, the nickname wasn't an insult. It was just her name. In the unspoken, high-pressure camaraderie of the kitchen, she had, in a moment of shared crisis, been accepted. Not as an equal, not yet, but as part of the machine. For Mark, the crack appeared in a tenant's apartment. An elderly woman, Mrs. DeLuca, had a perpetually leaking faucet that he had struggled to fix 3 times. On his 4th attempt, late on a Friday, he finally found the problem: a tiny, worn-out washer deep inside the fixture. As he replaced it, she stood by, telling him stories of her late husband, who had been a plumber. When he was done, and the faucet was finally, blessedly silent, she insisted he stay for a plate of pasta. He was tired, he was dirty, and he wanted to go home. But he saw the loneliness in her eyes, and he stayed. The pasta was the best he had ever eaten. She sent him home with a container of leftovers. These were not earth-shattering epiphanies. They were tiny, fragile moments of connection, born not of ambition or social maneuvering, but of shared labor and simple human kindness. They were the first, tentative green shoots pushing their way up through the scorched earth of their former lives. The hard year was far from over, but for the first time, the possibility of new growth, however painful, had begun to emerge. The therapy was brutal. The work was grinding, but it was the 10 hours a week at the Queen's Senior Center that truly began to dismantle them. In the beginning, they treated it as just another part of their sentence, a box to be checked. They showed up, went through the motions, and counted the minutes until they could leave. They were serving their time. But the funny thing about service, when it is stripped of any possibility of personal gain, is that it begins to work on you in ways you don't expect. The center was a microcosm of the world they had spent their lives ignoring. It was a place of worn linoleum floors, the lingering smell of disinfectant and stewed coffee, and a vibrant, stubborn, and often cantankerous community of people who had lived lives of astonishing richness and variety. These were not the wealthy, powerful seniors of Chelsea's charity galas. These were retired transit workers, seamstresses, teachers, and shopkeepers. They were people who, like me, had built the city with their hands and their sweat. And they had no time for pretense. David, accustomed to commanding a room, found himself utterly irrelevant here. His banking knowledge was useless. His former status was a liability. His first assignment was to serve lunch. He slopped lukewarm stew onto trays, his movements clumsy and resentful. But then he was assigned to the games room. There he met Mr. Isaiah Washington, a retired postal worker in his late 80s with sharp, intelligent eyes and hands gnarled by arthritis. Mr. Isaiah was the undisputed chess champion of the center. He saw the boredom and arrogance radiating from David and, with a sly grin, challenged him to a game. David, who had been captain of his prep school chess club, accepted with a condescending smirk. He was a master of strategy, of thinking 10 moves ahead. He was about to be profoundly humbled. Mr. Isaiah dismantled him in 12 moves, without a word, using a cheap, plastic chess set with a missing pawn. David stared at the board, stunned. They played again. And again. Every single Saturday for 3 months, David sat across from Mr. Isaiah, and every single Saturday, he lost. He wasn't just being outplayed, he was being taught. Mr. Isaiah never gloated. After each game, he would patiently reset the board and show David where he had gone wrong, explaining the quiet, patient logic of the game. He spoke of sacrifice, of positioning, of seeing the whole board, not just the next aggressive move. He was talking about chess, but he was also talking about life. In the quiet, methodical logic of the game, David began to see the catastrophic flaws in his own strategic thinking. He had always gone for the quick, ruthless capture, never understanding the quiet strength of a well-defended position. For the first time, he was learning from a man who had nothing to offer him but wisdom, and he found himself listening. Chelsea's journey began with a similar resistance. She was assigned to assist with the weekly cooking class, a task she found deeply insulting. She, who had dined at Michelin-starred restaurants, was now being asked to help elderly women make jello molds and tuna casseroles. She was paired with Miss Estelle, a tiny, formidable woman from Jamaica who ruled the small kitchen with an iron fist and a wooden spoon. Chelsea's initial attempts to improve the recipes with her sophisticated palate were met with a withering glare from Miss Estelle. "You cook with your heart, child, not with your head," the old woman had snapped. "This food is not for a magazine. It is for a memory." Humbled, Chelsea fell into line. She learned to chop vegetables the way Miss Estelle showed her, to listen for the right sizzle in the pan, to taste for salt not with a measuring spoon, but with her gut. She learned the stories behind the food. Miss Estelle's jerk chicken recipe was from her grandmother. A quiet Polish woman named Anya taught her to make pierogies, her hands moving with the muscle memory of 1,000 family holidays, her eyes misty as she spoke of a childhood in a country that no longer existed on a map. This wasn't about cuisine, it was about communion. It was about heritage. It was about feeding people not just to nourish their bodies, but to comfort their souls. Chelsea, who had once viewed food as a status symbol, began to see it as an act of love. She started bringing home the simple, hearty dishes from the center, and she and David would eat them in their small kitchen, the first real meals they had ever shared. For Mark, the change came through his hands. His supervisor at the maintenance company, a man who also volunteered at the center, noticed his growing skill. He started giving Mark the side jobs, the small, personal repairs the seniors needed but couldn't afford. A loose handrail, a sticky window, a shelf that needed to be lowered. Mark found himself, on his own time, visiting their small, cluttered apartments. He fixed things. But more than that, he listened. He learned to drink the impossibly sweet tea they offered him, to look at the faded photographs on their walls, to hear the stories of their lives while he worked. He wasn't Mark Carter, the disgraced engineer. He was just the boy who's good with his hands. He rewired a lamp for a woman whose husband had made it in a high school shop class 60 years ago. He built a small, sturdy ramp for a man who could no longer manage the single step up to his front door. These were not grand engineering projects. They were small, simple acts of practical kindness. But for Mark, they were a revelation. He was using his skills not to build something impressive, but to make someone's life a little bit easier, a little bit safer. He was solving real, human problems. The gratitude he received, a warm smile, a plate of cookies, a heartfelt "God bless you, son," was more satisfying than any bonus he had ever received. He was finding a sense of purpose not in his title, but in his utility. The reports came to me through back channels. The director of the senior center, a woman whose work I had quietly supported for years, would call me every few weeks. Zeke received weekly updates from their work supervisors. The therapists provided anonymized, high-level summaries of their progress. I was observing from a distance, a silent, unseen presence in their lives. And what I was hearing was unexpected. They weren't grandstanding. They weren't performing for credit. The changes were quiet, internal. The reports spoke of a growing humility in David, a newfound warmth in Chelsea, a quiet confidence in Mark. They were showing up early. They were staying late. They were beginning to see the people around them not as props in their own lives, but as protagonists in their own stories. Genuine empathy, that most elusive of human emotions, was beginning to replace the cold, hard calculus of entitlement. They were learning to serve. And in learning to serve others, they were beginning to save themselves. I sat in my quiet apartment, looking out at the city lights, a glass of wine in my hand. The reports were spread out on the table in front of me. This had started as an exercise in punishment, a cold and calculated reckoning. I had wanted to break them, to shatter their arrogance, to force them to feel a fraction of the humiliation they had so casually inflicted on me. But something else was happening. Something I hadn't anticipated. In the crucible of their hard year, they were not just being broken, they were being reforged. The cracks of grace were appearing, and through those cracks, a new, and perhaps better, version of my children was beginning to emerge. The thought was both terrifying and, for the first time in a very long time, tinged with a fragile, dangerous emotion I had thought long dead, hope. 8 months after the night at the terrace, I did something I had sworn to myself I would never do again. I invited them to dinner. The invitation was not sent through Zeke. It was not a summons. It was a simple, handwritten card, sent to their small apartment in Astoria. I asked them to come to my home in Westchester, a quiet, unassuming house I had bought years ago as a private retreat, a place they had never known existed. It was not a palace. It was a simple, comfortable home surrounded by old trees and a sprawling, slightly wild garden. It was the only place that was truly and completely mine, untouched by the ghosts of their entitlement. I specified the date and time, adding a single line at the bottom, no pretense. They arrived on a Sunday evening, just as the sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across the lawn. They didn't come in a sleek German sedan, but in a 10-year-old Honda Civic that Mark had bought for cash, a car he had learned to maintain himself. They looked different. The physical changes were the most obvious. They were thinner, leaner. David's hands were no longer the soft, manicured hands of a banker, they were the calloused, capable hands of a man who worked with them. Chelsea's face, free of the expensive makeup she used to wear like armor, was unadorned, and the fine lines of fatigue around her eyes were offset by a new, quiet clarity in her gaze. Mark stood straighter, his shoulders no longer slumped in a perpetual cringe of complicity. They were tired. They were worn down. But they were not broken. The raw, desperate terror of the hotel suite had been replaced by a kind of quiet, weary gravity. They had walked through the fire, and it had burned away everything that was not essential. I met them at the door. I had debated for days what I would wear. In the end, I chose a simple pair of linen trousers and a soft cashmere sweater. I wore no jewelry except my wedding band. This was not about power. It was about seeing what, if anything, was left. "Hello," I said. The word felt strange, both inadequate and monumental. "Hi, Mom," David said, his voice quiet. It was the first time he had called me that in what felt like a lifetime, and the word was not a plea or a manipulation. It was just a statement of fact. They stepped inside. There was no grand foyer, just a warm, comfortable living room with overflowing bookshelves and a fireplace. I had cooked myself. The menu was simple, a roast chicken, potatoes from my garden, a fresh salad. It was the kind of meal I used to make for them when they were boys, before money and ambition had poisoned everything. The conversation at the dinner table was stilted at first, a delicate, tentative dance around the massive, unspoken truth of the past 8 months. They didn't complain about their jobs. They didn't speak of their humiliation. Instead, they talked about the people they had met. David spoke of Mr. Isaiah, and the brutal, beautiful logic of chess. "He sees the whole board," David said, looking at his hands. "I spent my whole life just trying to take the next piece. I never understood that sometimes the strongest move is to do nothing. To just hold your position." Chelsea talked about Miss Estelle, and the fight they'd had over the proper way to season a pot of collard greens. "She threw a wooden spoon at me," Chelsea said, a small, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time. "She said I was cooking from a book, not from my soul. I think she was right. I spent so much time trying to curate a perfect life, I forgot to actually live one." Mark told a story about Mrs. DeLuca, the woman whose leaky faucet he had finally fixed. He had gone back the week before to check on it and found her struggling to get her old, heavy air conditioning unit into the window. He had done it for her, and she had insisted on paying him with a jar of her homemade pickles. She looked so relieved, Mark said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't quite name. It was just a window unit. It took me 10 minutes. But for her, it was this huge, impossible problem. I realized I had the ability to solve someone's impossible problem, and it felt. He trailed off, searching for the word. It felt good. I finished for him, my voice gentle. He nodded, not meeting my eyes, but I saw the truth of it on his face. There was no spin in their stories. No attempt to grandstand or impress me. It was just the plain, unvarnished truth of their new lives. They were speaking about their work not as a punishment, but as an education. They were learning a new language, the language of service, of humility, of simple, human connection. After dinner, as we sat in the living room with cups of coffee, the conversation finally turned to the future. "Your year is almost over," I said, the statement hanging in the air. "In 4 months, the terms of our agreement will be fulfilled." They looked at me, their expressions unreadable. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the end of their sentence. I had a choice to make. I could hold them to the full, punitive letter of the law, or I could offer them a reprieve. The reports I've received have been encouraging, I said, choosing my words carefully. Zeke has confirmed that you have not missed a day of work. The director of the senior center speaks highly of your contributions. Your therapists have noted a significant change in your attitudes. I paused, taking a breath. I am willing to consider this a lesson learned. Your sentence has been served. If you wish it, you can stop. As of tomorrow, you are free. You can leave your jobs, find new ones. You can begin to rebuild your lives, free of my conditions. I had expected relief. I had expected grateful tears, a rush of thanks. Instead, I was met with a profound and unsettling silence. The three of them looked at each other, a silent, lightning-fast communication passing between them that I was not privy to. It was David who finally spoke, his voice clear and steady in a way I had not heard before. "No, Mom," he said. I stared at him, confused. "No? We'll finish the year," he said. He looked at Chelsea and Mark, who both gave firm, resolute nods. "Mr. Isaiah. He's teaching me about the endgame. I need to see it through. And Maria, on my crew, her son is graduating from community college next month. I promised I'd cover her shift so she could go. Miss Estelle is finally trusting me to make the gravy for the community Thanksgiving dinner," Chelsea added, her voice quiet but firm. "She said if I ruin it, she'll haunt me from the great beyond. I can't quit now." Mark spoke last. "I made a list," he said, almost to himself. "A list of all the small repairs the people at the center need. The things the landlords want fix. I've been doing one apartment a weekend, on my own time. I'm only halfway through the list." I sat there, stunned into silence. I had offered them an escape, and they had refused. They were choosing to continue. Not for me. Not out of fear. But for reasons of their own. For a promise made to an old man over a chessboard. For the trust of a formidable Jamaican cook. For a handwritten list of leaky faucets and broken handrails. They were no longer motivated by the pursuit of wealth or status. They were being guided by something else entirely, a sense of responsibility, of purpose, of connection to the people their lives were now intertwined with. In that moment, the power dynamic that had defined our family for 30 years, finally, completely, shattered. This was no longer about my money or their dependence. I had taken everything from them, and in the emptiness, they had found something real to hold on to. Something of their own. 1 year to the day after the incident that had broken their world, we had dinner again. It was not in my quiet Westchester home or at a fancy Manhattan restaurant. It was in the bustling, chaotic, brightly lit kitchen of the terrace, after the last of the dinner service had gone out. It was a simple staff meal, served on mismatched plates at a long, stainless steel table. Chelsea, her face flushed from the heat of the stoves, had cooked. It was a simple, hearty beef stew, a recipe she had learned from Miss Estelle. The table we sat at had been wobbly for weeks, a source of constant complaint from the staff. Mark had fixed it that afternoon, its legs now sturdy and level, and the kitchen itself, from the floors to the hoods, was gleaming. David and his crew had been in the night before, giving it a deep, thorough cleaning, making the place shine. We ate together, the four of us, surrounded by the noise and the camaraderie of the kitchen staff. And for the first time in my entire life, it felt like a real family dinner. The hard year bled into a second, then a third. The terms of their reckoning, once a cage, slowly transformed into the blueprint for a new life. The momentum of their service, of their labor, carried them forward, no longer propelled by my demands, but by their own burgeoning sense of purpose. I watched from a distance as the path I had violently forced them onto became a path they chose to walk themselves. 5 years after that first, real family dinner in the kitchen of the terrace, the landscape of our lives is unrecognizable. The changes are not a return to the old world, but the establishment of a new one, built on a foundation of truth, not transactions. David never went back to banking. The thought of returning to that world of abstract numbers and brutal ambition was, he once told me, like trying to put on a suit that was 5 sizes too small. He had been fundamentally reshaped by the physical reality of his labor, by the quiet dignity he'd found in a job well done. After his year on the janitorial crew, he stayed with the property management company. He didn't ask for a promotion. He earned one. He enrolled in night classes, getting credentials in hospitality management. He started at the bottom, working the front desk at one of my smaller boutique properties in Brooklyn. He learned every aspect of the business from the ground up, not as a vice president looking at a spreadsheet, but as a man changing a light bulb in a guest room, calming an irate customer, and signing the paychecks of the staff whose names he knew. Today, he manages 2 of those properties. He is respected by his staff, not for his last name, but for his work ethic. He is not the ruthless executive he once was. He is a quiet, competent, and deeply empathetic leader. He still has lunch once a month with Mr. Isaiah, their chess games now a friendly, evenly matched draw. He did not reclaim his old life, he built a new one of merit, not inheritance. Chelsea's transformation was, in many ways, the most profound. The heat of the kitchen burned away her brittle vanity, revealing a core of creativity and resilience she never knew she possessed. She discovered she not only had a talent for cooking, but a passion for it. The frantic, high-pressure environment of the line, which should have broken her, instead focused her. She thrived. Chef Antoine, her former tormentor, became her grudging mentor. He saw in her a relentless perfectionism and a surprisingly innovative palate. She rose through the ranks of the kitchen, not because of her connection to me, but in spite of it. She worked harder, stayed later, and pushed herself further than anyone. 2 years ago, when Antoine announced his retirement, he recommended her for the job of executive chef at the Terrace. I was not part of the decision. Eli and the board made the choice based solely on her performance. She had earned her place at the head of the very kitchen where she had once scrubbed pans. Under her leadership, the Terrace earned its 3rd Michelin star. She is no longer with David. Their marriage, built on a foundation of shared ambition and social climbing, could not survive the earthquake of their reckoning. The split was quiet, amicable, a mutual acknowledgement that they were no longer the same people who had exchanged vows. 2 years ago, Chelsea remarried. Her husband, a kind, grounded man named Ben, runs the family farm that is one of the Terrace's main produce suppliers. They met, fittingly, while arguing over the quality of a crate of heirloom tomatoes. They have a 1-year-old daughter. They named her Hope. Mark found his calling not in designing new things, but in adapting old ones. His year of fixing things for the seniors in Queens ignited a spark in him. He saw a profound and unmet need, helping the elderly modify their homes so they could age in place, with dignity and safety. He went back to school, getting certifications in universal design and accessible construction. He and Carmen, a compassionate and fiercely intelligent social worker he met while volunteering at the senior center, now run their own small, successful business. They adapt homes for aging in place, installing everything from walk-in showers and stairlifts to smart home technology that can help monitor for falls. It is not glamorous work. It is deeply practical, human-centered engineering. He uses his skills to give people the most precious gift of all, the ability to stay in their own homes, surrounded by their own memories. He and Carmen were married last spring in a simple ceremony in the garden of the Queens Senior Center. Mr. and Mrs. DeLuca were the guests of honor. And me? My life, too, has been transformed. The Tessa Carter Project, which began as a weapon, evolved into a platform, the YouTube channel grew, and I found I had a voice. I told my story, not just the dramatic parts, but the quiet, grinding, invisible years that came before. I spoke about Ellen. I spoke about scrubbing floors and the silent vow I made. The Invisible Mothers Foundation is now a national organization, fueled by the entirety of my fortune and the proceeds from my memoir, a bestseller. To everyone's surprise, it provides legal aid for victims of elder financial abuse, offers grants to grassroots senior centers, and funds stipends for low-income elderly women, allowing them a measure of the financial independence I fought so hard for. I no longer build my empire in secret. My work is to give away the fortress, brick by brick, to the women who need its shelter most. We have dinner together once a month. It is not an obligation. It is a choice. Sometimes it's at my home in Westchester. Sometimes it's a simple, late-night meal at the terrace, cooked by Chelsea after the kitchen has closed. Sometimes it's a boisterous, chaotic affair at Mark and Carmen's house, surrounded by friends from the senior center. The conversation is different now. We do not talk about money or status. We talk about work, about people, about the small, meaningful challenges of our days. David talks about a difficult employee he's trying to mentor. Chelsea describes a new dish she's creating. Mark tells us about a tricky ramp installation. There is an ease between them, a genuine respect for the lives they have built for themselves. The old resentments have faded, replaced by a shared understanding forged in the crucible of their hard year. They are repaying the money. They make a payment to the foundation every month, a significant portion of their new, more modest salaries. It will take them the rest of their lives. That is the point. It is not about the money. It is a constant, tangible reminder of the cost of their education. Our family was not repaired. The old, rotten structure was demolished. And in its place, we have built something new. Something smaller, quieter, but infinitely stronger. It is a relationship built not on obligation or transaction, but on a hard-won respect. I look at them now, my children, and I do not see the entitled strangers from that night at the terrace. I see a man who finds dignity in service, a woman who creates beauty from fire, and a son who uses his strength to make others' lives easier. I see flashes of the children they were, and glimpses of the good people they have finally become. The final ethic of our new life is simple. It is kindness without self-erasure, the understanding that you can be generous without allowing yourself to be consumed. It is boundaries enforced with love, not anger. And it is the profound, unshakable truth that respect is not something demanded by blood, but something earned, day by day, through the quiet, steady grace of your actions. This story is a testament to the unseen strength of those the world dismisses. It teaches that true worth is not defined by a job title or the opinions of others, but is forged in resilience and quiet dignity. Respect is not a birthright granted by family ties, it is earned through action and humility. The narrative powerfully reminds us that kindness without boundaries is self-erasure, and that it is never too late to reclaim your power, rewrite your story, and and demand that the world finally see you for who you truly are. Now, if you liked this story, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me which part surprised you the most. Each subscription and comment from you is a great motivation for us to keep sharing more meaningful things in life. Thank you very much.